Eva Sinclair walked confidently through the private jet terminal. She was used to this life. First-class flights, business meetings in different countries, and making decisions that changed industries. As a self-made billionaire, she had built her empire from the ground up. People respected her, admired her, and sometimes feared her sharp mind. But today, she felt something different in the air. Her assistant, Lena, walked beside her, checking last-minute details on her tablet. "Everything is set for your meeting in London, Miss Sinclair. The jet is ready for takeoff in 10 minutes. Ava nodded. She had a lot on her mind, but she never let emotions show on her face. That was how she survived in the business world. As she approached the aircraft, she noticed the pilot, Captain Richard Hayes, standing near the entrance. He was tall, with gray at his temples, and the posture of a man who had spent decades in the air. But instead of the usual polite greeting, his expression was unreadable. Cold. "Welcome aboard, Captain," Ava said smoothly. Captain Hayes gave a stiff nod. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice flat. Then, without another word, he turned and walked up the stairs into the jet. Ava frowned slightly. She was used to people acting differently around her. Some were nervous, others overly eager to impress. But this felt off, almost like resentment. Lena noticed it too. She leaned in and whispered, "That was weird, right?" Ava kept her face neutral. "It doesn't matter. Let's go." Inside, the private jet was as luxurious as ever. White leather seats, polished wood panels, and soft lighting made it feel more like a high-end lounge than an aircraft. Ava settled into her seat, pulling out her phone to check emails. The engines hummed to life, and the plane taxied toward the runway. The flight attendant, a young woman with a professional smile, came over. "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff, Miss Sinclair?" "Just water, please," Ava replied. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Prepare for takeoff." The jet lifted smoothly into the sky, climbing higher and higher. Ava glanced out the window at the city disappearing below. Another flight, another meeting, another deal to close. Nothing unusual. But as they reached cruising altitude, something small, but strange, happened. Lena pressed the call button for the flight attendant, but no one came. She pressed it again. Still, nothing. Ava raised an eyebrow. "That's odd." Lena stood up and walked toward the small galley where the flight crew usually stayed. A moment later, she returned, her face slightly pale. "They're just standing there," she whispered, "like they're waiting for something." Ava set her phone down slowly. She had been on hundreds of flights, but this one didn't feel normal. Something was wrong, and she intended to find out what it was. As the jet flew smoothly through the skies, Ava's thoughts drifted back to the business deals she had to finalize. But something kept bothering her. She glanced at Lena, who was busy tapping away on her tablet, but there was an unease in the air, something Ava couldn't shake off. The silence felt heavier than usual, and the crew's strange behavior was starting to get to her. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, finally offering drinks. But Ava noticed that the woman didn't make eye contact. The polite smile was still there, but it seemed forced. Ava felt a flicker of irritation. Normally, people who worked for her, whether it was in business or service, knew how to show respect. Yet this crew seemed distant, almost cold. "Can I get a coffee?" Ava asked, trying to keep things polite. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, glancing at Captain Hayes in the cockpit before she replied. "I'm afraid we're out of coffee, Miss Sinclair. Is there anything else?" Ava's eyes narrowed. That was odd. Out of coffee on a luxury flight. She had been on this jet countless times, and they always had everything stocked. "Fine, just some water then," Ava said, keeping her tone neutral. The flight attendant nodded and quickly walked away. But as she passed the galley, Ava couldn't help but notice the way she hurried, almost as if she was trying to avoid being seen. That was strange, even for someone who had served her so many times before. After a few more minutes, Ava stood up and walked toward the cockpit. It wasn't unusual for a businesswoman like her to check in with the crew, just a quick word to make sure everything was running smoothly. When she reached the cockpit door, she knocked lightly. The door opened, and Captain Hayes looked at her without saying a word. "Captain, is everything all right?" Ava asked, her voice steady but with a note of concern. He met her gaze for a long moment. "Everything's fine, Ms. Sinclair." His voice was calm, almost too calm, and Ava couldn't quite place the lack of warmth in his tone. Ava felt a flash of frustration. She had dealt with all kinds of people, from demanding clients to frustrated employees, but there was something about Hayes that unsettled her. His coldness wasn't just a personality trait, it felt deliberate. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know," Ava said, forcing a smile. She turned to leave, but before she could walk away, Hayes spoke again, his voice low and serious. "Is there anything else, Miss Sinclair?" Ava stopped. His words were strange, as if he was testing her. "No," she said, turning back towards the cabin. "Not at the moment." But as she returned to her seat, her mind raced. The crew's strange behavior wasn't a coincidence. It felt as though something was being hidden from her. Was there a problem with the plane? Was she in danger? She didn't know yet, but one thing was certain. Something was wrong. And Ava Sinclair wasn't one to back down from finding the truth. As the minutes passed, the unease inside the jet grew heavier. Ava tried to focus on the work in front of her, but the feeling that something was wrong kept nagging at her. She glanced at Lena, who was still absorbed in her tablet, her fingers typing quickly. But even Lena seemed to sense the odd atmosphere. A few moments later, the turbulence began. The jet shook a little, but nothing unusual for a flight at this altitude. Still, Ava's heart skipped a beat when she felt her seatbelt become loose. She pulled at it, but it wasn't clicking into place as it normally did. That's strange, Ava thought. She had been on this plane many times, and the seatbelts were always secure. She tugged again, but the belt refused to tighten. Something wasn't right. Turning to Lena, she asked, "Can you help me with this? The seatbelt isn't working." Lena looked up, immediately concerned. "That's odd. It's always been fine before. Let me check." As Lena started to work on the seatbelt, Ava noticed that the cabin seemed quieter than usual. The flight attendants were no longer moving about, and the cockpit door was closed, which was rare during a flight. Why was everything so still? Just then, the jet lurched again, more violently this time. Ava's stomach tightened as the turbulence worsened. She quickly turned her attention back to the seatbelt. It was definitely broken. Panic started to creep in. Was this a coincidence? Why hadn't the crew checked it before takeoff? And why hadn't the attendants responded to her request for help? Ava took a deep breath. She couldn't afford to let fear control her. She needed to stay calm and handle the situation with the poise that had gotten her through countless challenges in her life. She stood up, deciding to go directly to the cockpit. If she could speak with the captain, she might get some answers. The flight crew was supposed to make sure everything was in working order, and if they hadn't noticed the malfunctioning seatbelt, what else had they missed? As she walked toward the cockpit, Ava felt her pulse quicken. What was going on with the crew? Why were they acting like this? And why had they been so distant and unhelpful? When she reached the cockpit door, she knocked firmly. Captain Hayes opened it immediately, his eyes meeting hers with a blank expression. He didn't seem surprised to see her, but his posture was rigid, almost defensive. Ava tried to keep her voice steady. "Captain, there's something wrong with my seatbelt. I need it fixed immediately." He nodded slowly. "We'll take care of it, Miss Sinclair. You should go back to your seat." His response was quick, but his tone felt like a dismissal. Ava hesitated for a moment. There was something in his eyes, something that made her stomach tighten with unease. But she didn't say anything. She turned and walked back to her seat, her mind racing. As she sat back down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a simple malfunction. There was something much bigger going on, and she was determined to figure out what it was. Something was wrong with this flight. But what was it? Ava returned to her seat, her mind racing. The turbulence had passed, and the jet was now flying smoothly again. But the unease never left her. Her thoughts kept circling back to the strange behavior of the crew. Why had the pilot ignored her request for help? And why did the flight attendants seem so distant and nervous? Lena looked up from her tablet, sensing the tension. "Miss Sinclair, are you okay?" she asked softly. Ava forced a smile, trying to shake off her worries. "I'm fine, just a little uncomfortable with the situation." Lena nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "I noticed it too. The crew's acting weird." Ava leaned back in her seat, her eyes narrowing. Something was definitely off. She had been on dozens of private flights, and this was unlike any of them. The crew was usually friendly, professional, and always ready to assist. But now, it felt like they were hiding something from her. Then an idea struck her. Maybe it wasn't just the crew who was acting strangely. Maybe she needed to take a closer look at the situation herself. She wasn't going to sit back and ignore the signs. Ava opened her phone and began searching for the latest news on her business dealings. Her company had made some waves recently, but nothing that should have sparked such tension on a private flight. However, her mind kept wandering back to the strange behavior of Captain Hayes and the flight attendants. As she scrolled through her emails, she stumbled upon an old message from a few months ago, a message she had almost forgotten about. It was from an aviation company that had reached out to her for a potential partnership. Ava had turned them down after reviewing their background, and it seemed like they weren't the right fit for her company at the time. But what caught her attention now was the name of the person who had sent the email, Ava's old acquaintance, Greg Pearson. Greg had been one of the key people in the aviation industry who had tried to secure her business. He was known for his connections, but also for being ruthless when things didn't go his way. Ava's eyes widened. Had Greg been behind this? She quickly searched for more information on Greg Pearson and found something she hadn't expected. There were rumors circulating about his connections to a failed aviation startup, the same company that Captain Hayes had worked for. Ava remembered reading about it once, but it had never seemed important enough to follow up on. But now, everything started to click. Captain Hayes's anger and the cold treatment from the crew all made sense. They weren't just being rude. They were hurt. Captain Hayes had lost everything after Ava's company turned down Greg Pearson's deal. His career, his savings, and his future had crumbled. And now, on this flight, he was sitting behind the controls of the jet, flying her through the sky. Ava sat back, staring at the screen of her phone. As the pieces fell into place, Captain Hayes had been driven to this act by revenge, not just because of his failed career, but because he felt that Ava had played a part in it. The truth had surfaced, and now Ava knew the reason for the crew's strange behavior. But there was still one question on her mind. What was Captain Hayes planning to do next? She had to find out. Ava sat in her seat, the realization hitting her like a cold wave. Captain Hayes wasn't just a professional pilot. He was someone whose life had been destroyed by decisions she made, decisions that had nothing to do with him personally, but everything to do with the world of business they both occupied. She knew she had to confront him. There was no way she could sit back and pretend nothing was wrong, but she needed to be careful. The last thing she wanted was to provoke him into doing something rash, especially when she didn't fully understand what he might be capable of. Ava took a deep breath and stood up. She walked toward the cockpit once again, her heels clicking softly against the floor. This time, she didn't knock. She simply opened the door and walked in, her eyes meeting Captain Hayes's in the dimly lit space. He looked up, his expression unreadable. The usual coldness was there, but this time, there was something else. Something like frustration, like a man holding on to something he couldn't release. "I need to speak with you," Ava said, her voice steady. "It's important." Captain Hayes hesitated for a moment. He looked out the window, as if trying to find the right words. Then, without saying a word, he motioned for her to sit down. Ava took the seat across from him, her mind racing. She had no idea what he would say, but she knew it was coming. Whatever truth had been buried, it was time to bring it to light. "I know you're angry," Ava began, "and I understand why. But what I don't understand is why you're taking it out on me." Captain Hayes finally met her gaze. His eyes were dark, full of emotion, but they weren't the eyes of a man who was angry for the sake of it. These were the eyes of someone who had been hurt, someone who had lost everything. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice low and almost defeated. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything. To have your career, your future, taken from you because of a decision someone else made. I worked my whole life to get where I am. And then you came along and destroyed it." Ava's heart tightened. She had no idea how deep the pain ran for Captain Hayes. She knew business could be ruthless, but she hadn't realized how far-reaching the consequences of her decisions could be for others. "What are you saying?" she asked softly, leaning forward. "You're blaming me for your life falling apart." Captain Hayes's jaw clenched. He took a deep breath. And for a moment, Ava thought he might not speak at all. But then he finally let it out. "I was part of a team that worked for an aviation company, a small, growing company. We had a deal in place with your business, something that would have saved us. But when you turned it down, everything fell apart. We lost investors, we lost our contracts, and I lost my job. I lost my purpose." His voice cracked, but he quickly regained control. "You don't even know the full story. I was trying to fix it, trying to make things right, but nothing worked. You've had everything, and I've had nothing." Ava listened in silence, her mind processing what he said. It wasn't her fault that his company had failed, but she understood his pain. The world of business was unforgiving, and sometimes the smallest decisions could have life-altering consequences. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I didn't know what happened on your side, but I never meant to hurt anyone." Captain Hayes's expression softened for just a moment. "I know," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to understand." Ava sat back in her seat, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about a deal gone wrong. This was about people, lives, and the ripple effects of every decision. Captain Hayes's pain was real, and now that she understood it, she knew she had to find a way to fix this before it was too late. Ava sat quietly, absorbing everything Captain Hayes had shared. She could feel the weight of his words pressing on her chest. He wasn't just a disgruntled employee. He was a man whose entire life had been turned upside down because of choices she had made. Choices she had never known would affect someone like him so deeply. Captain Hayes remained silent, staring ahead at the controls of the jet. Ava could see that he wasn't just angry, he was lost. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about a deep sense of betrayal that had built up over time, leaving him feeling abandoned by the system. Ava knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't change the past, but she could do something about the future. She didn't want this moment to end with more anger or resentment. She had always been someone who faced problems head-on, someone who believed in finding solutions even when they seemed impossible. "Captain," Ava said finally, breaking the silence, "I can't undo what happened, but I want to make things right. I want to help you." Captain Hayes turned his head slowly, surprised by her words. "Help me?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. Ava nodded, her gaze steady. "I know it doesn't make up for the damage that's been done, but I can use my resources to help you rebuild. I'll offer a partnership, or at the very least, I'll support your future projects. There's always a way to fix things if you're willing to try." Hayes stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Ava could feel his skepticism hanging in the air, but she refused to back down. This wasn't just about offering money or business deals. This was about showing him that not everyone saw him as a failure. She wanted him to know that there was a way out of the dark place he had been living in for so long. "I don't need your charity," he said quietly, his voice cold again. "I don't want your pity." Ava's heart sank, but she didn't flinch. "This isn't charity. This is an opportunity. I know what it's like to struggle, to have doors slammed in your face, to lose something important. But you have skills. You're a good pilot, and there are ways we can work together to make something good come out of this." There was a long pause as Hayes considered her words. The tension in the cockpit was thick, but Ava didn't back away. She had always believed in the power of second chances, both for herself and for others. It was time to put that belief into action. Finally, Captain Hayes spoke, his voice softer but still filled with hesitation. "I spent so long holding on to my anger, trying to find a way to make you see what I've lost. But I don't know if I can just accept your offer." Ava gave him a reassuring smile. "It's not about accepting my offer right now. It's about understanding that you don't have to carry this weight on your own anymore. Let me help you rebuild, if not your company, then your peace of mind." For the first time since they had begun this conversation, Captain Hayes looked at her without any trace of hostility. There was still doubt in his eyes, but there was also a glimmer of something else, hope, or maybe just the possibility of a new beginning. Ava knew this was only the first step. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she was willing to take it one step at a time. Maybe this was how things could finally be set right. Ava sat back in her seat, her thoughts swirling. She had made her offer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe it might actually work. She had offered Captain Hayes an opportunity, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy for him to accept. After everything he'd been through, trust didn't come easily. The flight continued on. The sound of the jet's engines humdrumming in the background, but Ava couldn't shake the weight of the conversation. She glanced over at Lena, who was still typing on her tablet, but now her fingers moved more slowly, as if processing what had just happened. Ava was used to making decisions that impacted people, but this felt different. This was personal. It wasn't about business anymore. It was about helping a man who had been broken by the same system that had made her rich. Could she really make a difference? She wasn't sure, but she was willing to try. She looked out the window, the clouds floating past in soft, cotton-like clusters. There was something peaceful about the view, something that reminded her that there was more to life than just profits and contracts. She had been so focused on climbing to the top for so long that she had forgotten about the people who got left behind. "Ms. Sinclair." Lena's voice broke her from her thoughts. Ava turned to see her assistant standing by the seat, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, Lena?" Ava asked. "I've been thinking. You're really serious about helping Captain Hayes, aren't you?" Ava nodded. "I am. He's not just some pilot with a grudge. He's a person, and I believe he deserves a second chance. We all do at some point." Lena's eyes softened. "You know, I think you're right. People can change, especially when they're given a reason to. But do you think he'll take you up on the offer? After everything that's happened?" Ava sighed. She didn't have an answer for that. She had done all she could, and now it was up to Captain Hayes. She could offer help, but she couldn't force him to accept it. It had to be his choice. She stood up, deciding it was time to check on the situation in the cockpit again. There was still something unsettled about the whole thing, but now it felt more like a conversation that needed to happen. Captain Hayes wasn't just angry anymore. He was confused, hurt, and possibly even relieved that someone was finally trying to understand him. When she knocked on the cockpit door, it opened almost immediately. Captain Hayes was sitting in the pilot's seat, his hands resting on the controls. He looked up at her with a faint hint of surprise in his eyes. "You okay?" Ava asked, her voice soft. He nodded. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Ava smiled gently. "I understand. I know you're probably not ready to accept my offer, but I just want you to know that I'm here if you need me. No one should have to carry the weight of their mistakes alone. And we don't have to fix everything right now. We can take it one step at a time. Captain Hayes looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Thank you, Ms. Sinclair. I don't know if I'm ready, but I'll think about it. I haven't had anyone offer help like this in a long time." Ava nodded. "Take all the time you need, but just know that the offer is always there." With that, she left the cockpit, her heart a little lighter. She had made a choice to offer something that wasn't about power, but about second chances, and that, for now, felt like the right decision. As the hours passed, the jet continued its smooth journey through the sky. Ava felt a quiet sense of anticipation building in her. She had done all she could, offered a chance for redemption, and a way out of the anger that had consumed Captain Hayes for so long. Now it was up to him to decide if he wanted to take that path. Ava knew that nothing could change the past, but she hoped that the future could be different. She had made her offer, and she had been honest. It was a rare thing for someone like her to be vulnerable, but she had done it because she believed in the possibility of change. The right kind of change, not just for herself, but for others too. She sat in her seat, staring out of the window. The sky had begun to darken as evening approached, and the lights of cities below twinkled in the distance. For a moment, she let herself relax, letting go of the tension that had been building inside her all day. But just as she was about to close her eyes and enjoy the peace, the cockpit door opened. Lena looked up first, and Ava could see that something had changed. Her assistant's expression was a mix of concern and curiosity. Ava stood up, walking toward the cockpit without hesitation. She knew something was about to happen. When she reached the door, she knocked softly and opened it. Captain Hayes was standing by the controls, his back to her, but he didn't turn around when she entered. Instead, he spoke without looking at her. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice steady but with an undertone of uncertainty. "I've thought about everything you said, and I can't say I'm fully convinced, but there's one thing I know for sure." Ava waited, her heart racing, not sure if this was going to be a breakthrough or another roadblock. "What's that?" she asked gently. "I don't want to keep carrying this weight anymore. I don't want to keep hating something that I can't change." He paused, turning around to face her. His eyes were still guarded, but there was something different in them, a shift, a softening. Ava's heart lifted slightly, but she remained composed. "It's not easy to let go of pain," she said quietly, "but you don't have to keep it all inside. Let me help you." Captain Hayes nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I've held on to this for so long, I didn't know who I was without it." He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping a little, as if a burden had just been released. "But maybe it's time to let it go." Ava stepped forward, her voice calm and understanding. "It's not about forgetting, Hayes. It's about moving forward. You can't change what happened, but you can change what happens next." For the first time since they had started this conversation, Captain Hayes smiled, though it was small and tentative. I guess I have been stuck for too long. Maybe it's time to find a new direction." Ava smiled in return, feeling the tension that had held her captive for so long begin to lift. "There's no rush," she said. "Take your time, but know that I'm here to help, whenever you're ready." The quiet between them was filled with something new, hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. Ava had no idea where the journey would lead from this point, but she knew that, for now, she had given him the one thing he needed more than anything: a chance to breathe, a chance to rebuild. And that was enough. The flight was nearing its end as the jet began its descent. Ava gazed out the window, watching the lights of the city grow larger. For the first time in hours, she felt a sense of calm settle within her. The conversations with Captain Hayes had been intense, filled with emotions, but now they had reached a place of understanding. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a start. Captain Hayes had accepted her offer. He hadn't agreed to everything just yet, but he had agreed to give it a chance. That was all she could ask for. As the plane touched down smoothly, Ava gathered her things, preparing to leave. She had accomplished what she set out to do, to offer help and show a path forward. Whether or not Hayes would take it was now in his hands. But she felt hopeful. She knew this was the first step toward something better. Lena stood by the door, ready to exit, but before she could speak, Ava turned to her with a smile. "It went well," she said softly, almost to herself. Lena raised an eyebrow, sensing that there was more to it than just a successful business meeting. "Are you sure? You seemed pretty tense earlier." Ava nodded. "It's always tense when you're trying to help someone who's been hurt for so long, but I think we're getting somewhere." Lena smiled, and the two of them walked down the steps of the jet onto the tarmac. The cold night air was refreshing after the long flight, and Ava took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few hours begin to lift. As they approached the waiting car, Ava caught a glimpse of Captain Hayes standing by the jet, watching them. He didn't say anything, but there was something different in his posture now, something that spoke of quiet determination. Ava wasn't sure what was next for him, but she knew he was no longer holding on to the bitterness that had once controlled him. "Take care of yourself, Captain," Ava called out, her voice warm but firm. He gave a small nod, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. "I will. Thank you for the chance." Ava didn't respond, but she felt a small sense of pride. She had made the right decision. She had given him the space to decide, and now it was up to him to walk the path he had chosen. As she settled into the back seat of the car, Ava let her thoughts wander back to her own journey. She had worked hard for everything she had, her wealth, her influence, her business. But tonight had reminded her of something important. Success wasn't just about what you built for yourself. It was about the people you helped along the way, the ones you gave a chance to. The car pulled away from the runway, and Ava looked out the window, her mind already thinking ahead. There were new challenges on the horizon, new deals to close, and new opportunities to explore. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she had made a difference. It wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And that was enough.